I hope you are doing well and staying safe. This is Janice Thompson from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining us for day 2 of the Tribal Veterans Healing to Wellness Court virtual training. Today's session is co-occurring disorders. Before we get started, here are a few housekeeping notes for today's session. Your control panel will appear on your user screen. All attendees will be muted during this presentation. Once you call into the meeting call line, enter your PIN. You may use the chat box on your right panel to submit questions during the presentation. There will also be an opportunity to submit questions to presenter on the final slide. There will be polling questions on slides 9, 10, and 11. Please use the poll box to participate. To minimize the control panel, use the orange arrow at the top left panel. Following this webinar, please complete the evaluation. A notification email will be sent out containing a recording of the session, a PDF of the PowerPoint, and any handouts that may be referenced. It will also be posted on wellnesscourts.org. I will now turn the time over to our presenters.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pacheco, and by training, I'm a licensed drug and alcohol abuse counselor here in the state of New Mexico. And thank you for joining us today. We wish this was all in person, but unfortunately, this is how we're going to do this. Or fortunately, this is how we get to be together. So today's session is on co-occurring disorders. For those of us who have been in the field for a while, we would also have known it as a dual diagnosis. And we also know it as something called comorbidity. So when we talk about comorbidity, we're talking about a person that has 2 or more disorders. And when we're talking about disorders, we're talking about those DSM-5 disorders. I'm still kind of in an old school mode of DSM-4, where you had your axis 1 and your axis 2 and your axis 3 and and so on. But now we have these different classifications. And so when we're talking, again, like I said, about comorbidity, we're talking about an individual that has 2 or more at the same time or one after the other. And this occurs frequently with substance use and mental health disorders. As we know, this month is Mental Health Month, so this is a very timely presentation. So it also means that there's an interaction between these 2 disorders that can worsen both. For example, alcohol use or some kind of drug use can exacerbate or make a mental health disorder worse. For example, depression, because alcohol is a depressant, it further causes that person deeper into that depression. So we often will see individuals that we in the field we call self-medicating. Unfortunately, it's not to any benefit. It actually makes the mental health disorder worse. So joining me today, we will have 2 very expert people in the field who work in Native American communities. So we have Jill Campoli, who is a clinician with the Pueblo Pojoaque. And we also have Lori Vallejos, who is a licensed social worker from the Pueblo of Laguna Behavioral Health Services. So we will be taking you through this presentation, and we'll be changing off on the slides. And like Janice said, there are opportunities for you to be interactive in polls through the vignettes that we have put in this presentation. So we hope you enjoy this information. Next slide.
When we look at who is affected, I don't know about you guys, but I love statistics and research. And I know that's not everyone's favorite thing, but I think it's important for us to set the stage of when we're talking about co-occurring disorders, that we have an idea what the numbers look like. So I'm not going to read all of these, but I think a couple to highlight are 7.7 million adults have co-occurring mental and substance use disorders. The key thing that I like about this statistic is to pay attention to is this doesn't mean that one caused the other, and it can be difficult to determine which came first. Chris touched on this when she was talking about someone who has an alcohol use disorder and depression. The question that we always get is, were they depressed and they started drinking? Or were they drinking and that caused the depression? So I think this goes back to the age-old question of what came first, right? The chicken and egg one. So, it's hard for us to say without combing through or someone getting sober to figure out, are we looking at depression? Are we looking at alcohol use disorder? Or are we having to treat both? So I know this comes across, for those of you who are operating with some healing to wellness courts now, you probably see this often when people are getting into your program, is they come in with a host of problems. And as clinicians or as treatment providers, we're trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we treat this person? How do we make sure to provide them the best services possibly? So that's important to know, is we may not have the answer to what came first. We just know that we have some issues that are presenting that we need to address while someone is in the program. So going on to, when we look at the veteran population specifically, there's some numbers that have come out of some of the research done by VA Hospital. And as they report, is 74% of Vietnam veterans with PTSD had comorbid substance use disorders. Now, when we look at another study that was done later on related to Operation Enduring Freedom, the numbers dropped somewhat, but still we were looking at 63% of those diagnosed with alcohol use disorder also had a diagnosis of PTSD. So we know history, and we know what was going on in Vietnam, and we saw what happened with those returning from Vietnam who had addiction with opioids and alcohol and other substances. But 63% is still a high number. So when we're looking at the veteran population, we need to be aware of this and mindful of these co-occurring disorders. Next slide. So right now I'm looking at who gets treatment, and these numbers are coming from a study that was done by NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse. And so in the general population, 52.5% receive neither mental health nor substance abuse treatment. So when I look at that number, and I work within the Pueblo of Laguna Behavioral Health, that's a huge number, right? We think that we're helping a lot of people, but 52.5% in the general population receive neither of these services. 34.5% receive mental health care only. And I wonder, when I look at that, I wonder why that is, that it's only the mental health care. I think about stigma. Would I rather go in and say, I need to be treated for depression, or I have anxiety, versus I have a substance abuse problem? Okay, so that's something for us to think about as clinicians. And when we're screening people, is, are we asking those questions? Are we screening for substance abuse? 9.1% receive both mental health care and substance use treatment. These are usually our participants in programs such as a Healing to Wellness Court, right? We're providing the substance use treatment in addition to the mental health needs. All right, next slide, please. Go back. Okay, so again, from the same study done by NIDA, what are the barriers to getting treatment? For those of you who are already in operation with the program, I'd like you to think about this, just absorb the information. And for those of you who are not operating yet and maybe are thinking of starting up a veterans court or a wellness court, to think about these barriers and how do we address that as providers. So among the adults with co-occurring disorders who did not receive mental health care, their reasons for not receiving it were 52% said they could not afford the cost. I don't know about your programs. Right now, here within the Pueblo of Laguna, we are still fortunate we're not charging for services, but I know that's not the case with every program. So is treatment affordable within your program or within your communities? 23% did not know where to go for treatment. I don't know that that's a problem within tribal communities, because guess what? There's one place to go for treatment, and that's the local behavioral health. But if you are in a bigger community, do people know where to find you? How do they look? How do they receive your services? You know, the next number that I see, the 23%, really stands out to me this morning. So 23% said they could handle the problem without treatment. The reason this number stands out to me today, and if I would have looked at this yesterday, it would have been different. But this morning, before this session, I was on a Zoom meeting with our MRT, with our Healing to Wellness participants. And we had one of our participants say, you know, prior to this program getting it, I thought I could handle this on my own. And this is one of those, so we have a graduation. And so this is one of our people who is saying, I couldn't handle this on my own, despite my thoughts of I could do this by myself. I think a lot of people who get into our programs think I can do this on my own. So I believe that number, and maybe it's even higher, you know, than the 23% that it was in 2018, but a lot of people think that they can work this out on their own without any of our services. 13.6% thought fear of being committed. I don't know if you've ever talked to some people who are looking to receive services or get into a program. They say, is this going to last forever? How long? I heard this is like a year program or 2-year program, or, you know, there's a lot of time. So people are afraid. You know, what does that mean when I get into treatment? Are you going to keep me for the next 5 years? Or is there an end in sight? So I think it's important that we're clear about these things. 12.4% talk about that it might cause the neighbors or community to have negative opinions. So what does that say if I get into your program? Are people, what are they going to think about me? Is everyone going to know that, oh, I'm in that program, and we know that all the other people were there, oh, they had a lot of problems. So how does the community view us? How do the people who are looking for services, how do they view you? So the last one that I wanted to highlight, there's a couple more in between that I'm not going to go through all of them, but the last one, and I think this is even maybe higher within tribal communities, is the 10.1% concerned about confidentiality. We all have heard that, oh, I don't want to go get services there because everyone knows everything about everybody. What happens when they see you walking into that building? Oh, you must be in trouble. Oh, you're in trouble again. Look at you. You're right there at the behavioral health building. What did you do? Oftentimes in tribal communities, it may not be the clinicians or your staff, right? It's just the stigma of going in the building for behavioral health services. So we need to be mindful about confidentiality. Next slide. So the next slide is among adults with co-occurring disorders who did not receive substance use care, their reasons for not receiving it were, and I like to highlight the first one, is not ready to stop using. When you're visiting somebody, let's say somebody's in detention and you're having to go do a crisis call there, do you ever ask them, are you ready to stop using? Your readiness to change? So the highest number there is 38.4%. They said that I am not ready to stop using. How do you work with that? When somebody is in a position where they're getting referred into your program and they say, I'm not ready to stop, but I don't want to do 6 months in jail either, right? So what is your approach in working with clients who are not ready to stop using? So there's a couple more facts there, and if anyone is interested in reading all of them, again, NIDA did this study in 2018. Another thing I want to, if someone's doing the math on these numbers right now, is respondents could provide more than one response for these. So they had an option on this. So it's not going to tally up to your 100%, but I would encourage you to go to this website, look up this study, and read more about it. Next slide. So now let's get to veterans and substance use. So when we're looking at treatment of co-occurring PTSD and substance use disorders in veterans, the VA does say that co-occurring disorders do happen with our veteran population. So when we're looking at treating our veterans, what kind of treatment is recommended, right? Do we treat veterans like we do the rest of our population? Clearly no. If any of you were tuning in yesterday to the presentation that was done, I really liked how they talked about individualized treatment planning, right? We have to know who we're treating. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today because I think they did a great job with highlighting that yesterday. And I really think that they did a great job on talking about trauma-informed care, right? You're going to be hearing that with all of the presentations throughout this week here by Tribal Law and Policy Institute. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I do want to highlight some of the modalities of treatment that are known effective for our veteran population. So when we're looking at people going to veterans to the VA hospital, there's two modalities of treatment that are probably their top two in treating the veterans. And the first one is prolonged exposure. The second would be cognitive processing therapy. So for those of you who are not familiar with prolonged exposure teaches you to gradually approach trauma-related memories, feelings, and situations that you have been avoiding since your trauma. By confronting these, you can decrease your PTSD symptoms. Okay, so what type of treatment is prolonged exposure? Well, prolonged exposure is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it is a psychotherapy that is designed specifically for PTSD. So when, as I was looking on the VA website, and we'll post that later on, that you can read more in depth about these modalities of treatment and their approach. I really like that they talked about, so this type of therapy is used with patients with complicated presentations, and I'm using their language verbatim on this one. So this is including those with comorbidities such as substance use disorders. When I read that, I kind of laughed, and I have all respect for the VA hospital and what they're doing, because they're the ones that are doing this treatment at that level. But I laughed about it because guess what? Those are our applicants and our participants in Healing to Wellness courts, right? So I really laughed with complicated presentations. This is what we see every day. This is who we're working with. So, it's important for us to be mindful of what's working in treating veterans so that we can incorporate that. We can do the trainings for prolonged exposures and these other modalities of treatment that are working, especially that, when we're treating our veteran population. So usually when we look at prolonged exposure, the average length of time for these sessions through VA would be 8 to 15 sessions at about 90 minutes each session. We know that when someone gets into our program, we have much longer time to work with our participants. So, I guess I wonder, and maybe, somebody here has more information, is how do we extend this from the 8 to 15 sessions if we're working with somebody within our program, since we do have up to a year to work with participants. There's a couple of key components when we're looking at prolonged exposure of what they try to do. And the first one is psychoeducation about treatment, common reactions to trauma, and breath retraining. So teaching people how to handle those situations. How do you breathe through this? How do you cope with this when you're experiencing trauma? The second thing that prolonged exposure does is it talks about imaginal exposure, which requires repeatedly retelling trauma, present tense and aloud, and listening to recordings out of sessions. For any of you clinicians who were trained, years ago in dealing with trauma, this was something different for me. And the reason it was different is because years ago, probably in 2000, as I started working with trauma patients, I was trained at that time of we don't keep retelling the trauma because it re-traumatizes. Okay, so this was different for me to think about someone having to retell their trauma, because that's not how I was trained years ago. So this is a new way that the veterans, the VA is talking about treating veterans with PTSD. The third thing that prolonged exposure addresses is it does in vivo exposure to places and things and situations that are avoided because they evoke distress and anxiety. So a client may have to go and maybe they're afraid of large crowds. So they might work with their therapist to say, how am I going to be in a crowd of 5 people? Because, I've never been able to do that before. So that's another component of this type of therapy that is worked on. And the fourth thing that they work on, and the last thing, is emotional processing, focusing on the experience of exposure and the impact on thoughts related to self, the world, and the trauma. Okay, so these are all very important areas that need to be addressed during the course of treatment. And now shifting over to the cognitive processing therapy. This is also a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's been proven effective for treating PTSD. And the other thing is, as I kept reading more and finding out more about the cognitive processing therapy, it's also been known and proven effective for patients or clients with TBIs, with brain injuries, and also personality disorders. So they've expanded the research to get past just veterans and also looking at other populations. Well, this isn't as the research, they're probably recommending the prolonged exposure over cognitive processing therapy, but it's still an option for some people. And the 5 key things that this therapy addresses is safety, trust, control, esteem, and intimacy. And that, when we look at those 5 things, think about some of your veteran clients. How do they feel safe in the world? Are they able to connect with others? Do they feel understood by other people? You know, when they re-enter the community, do they feel like they're a part of, or do they still feel alienated from the community, even their community, their home place, right? So these are, you know, in looking at these, it focuses on teaching a set of skills that will help you challenge the negative thoughts and gain control over the impact they have on your life. So part of VA's policy, it says that they should be offered evidence-based treatment. That's what we just talked about for both the disorders. So VA is not going to say we will treat you for PTSD, but we're not going to treat you for substance use disorders. They say part of our policy is we will be treating for both. And best practice says that we should be treating for both, right? We know that in our programs is that we're not going to treat one or the other. Best practice says we should be treating both simultaneously. Next slide.
Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to go through a few vignettes, give you some examples of the type of individuals we might see in the Veterans Court. So I'll start with vignette 1. Ernest is a 44-year-old Santa Clara Pueblo male. He has a long history of alcohol-related charges through the tribal court in Santa Clara Pueblo, including multiple DUIs and public intoxication charges. He is an Iraq veteran who saw combat as an Army EMT. Ernest was discharged with a less than honorable status. Ernest has severe medical issues that limit physical mobility, and he struggles with chronic pain. He also has COPD and diabetes. When Ernest consumes alcohol for several days in a row, he tends to cause problems in the community, which often look like flashbacks to his time in combat. He struggles to engage with medical services through the VA in Albuquerque. Ernest lacks the resources such as a car, a working cell phone, and even family support to help coordinate and attend appointments with his medical providers at the VA hospital. He frequently complains that his health issues such as chronic pain, PTSD, create triggers for use of alcohol. With the current COVID-19 concerns and the Pueblo of Santa Clara having tribal stay-at-home orders, Ernest is at a higher risk. The Healing to Wellness Court team is concerned about his medical and mental health well-being, and also public safety. So what we're going to be doing after the vignettes is starting the poll. So I'm going to start off and show you guys some questions, and then you'll have an opportunity to do some interactive answering the questions, and then we can see as we go through you know, how you guys are responding and some of the ideas that came up in response to the vignettes. So the first question, so what co-occurring issues is Ernest experiencing? A, generalized anxiety disorder and alcohol use, major depressive disorder and alcohol use disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol use disorder, or acute stress disorder and alcohol use disorder. Okay. So I'll give it a few more seconds for everyone to jump in. It looks like only about a quarter of you have voted yet, so. Okay. So it looks like we've got a few people jumping in and answering here for number 1, you know, generalized anxiety disorder and alcohol use disorder, about 7% for major depressive disorder and alcohol use disorder. And it looks like the majority of you have selected post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol use disorder. And acute stress disorder and alcohol use disorder, if you have selected that as well. What we're looking at with Ernest is the co-occurring issues are post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol use disorder. I think what was interesting about this question is that, you know, we do see those signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression when we're working with post-traumatic stress. And it is hard, and it's important for us to do proper screening to understand when people are coming in with post-traumatic stress disorder so that we can tailor the treatment and the treatment plan to address that. So it looks like the majority of you did see that was the co-occurring issue with Ernest. So I'll go on to the next question. Okay. In knowing that the co-occurring issues for Ernest, what issues would you all address first? Would you address the substance use issues first? The medical health issues? Would you approach all of the issues together, or substance use issues first? I'll give you time to answer. So I think we're seeing some other answers here, some questions about whether the medical issue, there's quite a few that are responding that medical health issues should be addressed first, and some that say the substance issues should be addressed first. You know, in reality, and what can be challenging for, you know, complex cases, as Lori mentioned, you know, most of the folks that we have in wellness court are going to have a variety of challenges and barriers that they're facing. It's best practice at this point for Ernest if we can incorporate the ways that the medical health issues, the substance use, and the mental health are impacting him all at once. That's going to be our best practice. And we can get into that in the next couple questions about, you know, how we might be able to address that for him. But as you know, it's important for us, you know, to look at the bigger picture of the person. The beauty of the wellness court is that we do get to know them very well over that time. And, you know, seeing their life and the medical part is really important for our veterans. Many of them do struggle with access to care. So in looking at his barriers, lack of transportation, lack of a phone, and really connecting with the VA, it's important that we incorporate his wellness in the medical area as well for the best practice for him. And again, in the slide, there's another important thing to note, that Ernest, it said that Ernest was discharged in a less honorable way. And he still has access to care at the Veterans Hospital. Some people might think that, you know, they wouldn't have access, they wouldn't be allowed there or welcomed there, but it's important to note that veterans who are discharged, you know, less than honorably are still welcome to come and receive services there. So I'll move on to the next question. So how do his medical issues influence his mental health and our substance use treatment? Do his medical issues not impact his mental health or substance use? Do the medical issues, are they critical to the success of his treatment? Do the medical issues impact only his substance use, or do they only impact his mental health? So I can see that 100% of you are saying that the medical issues are critical to the success of his treatment. And, you know, we're going to see that more as we go through the slides. It's important to address this. Many of our veterans are going to have some barriers with their health. So it needs to be integrated into his mental health and substance use care that we're addressing those issues. And the next question, what are some case management considerations? So for this client, and for all clients that we come in, that come into our wellness courts, case management can be such a critical part. I'm always telling our navigator, our coordinator that, her role is so important. And, the coordinators can do so much to support our clients in the ways that, maybe the rest of the team are they're focused on their job. So when we look at case management for Ernest, this client, is case management only going to address the mental health related outcomes, the substance use related outcomes, or would it not be appropriate for this client, or can it address medical needs and positively impact outcomes? It looks like 100% of you know that the case management can make a positive impact on Ernest's medical needs and create positive outcomes, and not only for him and his health, but for his mental health and substance use. All right, well, thank you for the first layer of participation. Again, at the end, we can take some questions about the vignettes or the rest of the presentation. So thank you. I'll pass it on to the next person.
All right, so as we look at Vignette 2, and I really do appreciate everyone for participating in the voting on that. I really like that this makes it interactive since we can't be seeing you guys face to face right now. So Vignette 2, take some time to read that. I'll read it aloud, and then we're going to do the same thing and ask a couple of questions about this. So Mike is a 28-year-old Laguna male who has recently returned from his last enlistment in the military. On this specific enlistment, he received a discharge that was less than honorable. Mike is being seen at Laguna Behavioral Health Services due to his recent charges of intoxication and assault. He also has one prior intoxication charge and a probation violation charge for testing positive for meth. In talking with Mike about his military experience, he can recall leaving the military at 18 years old and says this was his first time leaving the reservation. Mike says that he remembers the first years enlisted and the drinking that went along with his military time. In the last years of enlistment, Mike tried meth while stationed in California. Since his return to Laguna, Mike has been isolating from family and the community, and his substance use has continued. So let's go to the polls right now. And the question is, all right, what co-occurring disorder do you think Mike may be experiencing? And I'm going to have to read this because it's not going to fit on your screen. So your first choice would be A, generalized anxiety disorder, alcohol use disorder moderate, and stimulant use disorder mild. B, alcohol use disorder moderate, stimulant use disorder mild, rule out depression, and rule out post-traumatic stress disorder. And for those of you who aren't completely familiar with what rule out means, it means that we need to gather more information to determine if a diagnosis fits. And C, post-traumatic stress disorder, alcohol use disorder moderate, avoidant personality disorder. So if you can take a couple of minutes and vote on that. I see that some of you are already voting. So as you're thinking about this, I feel like when we were talking about this, I feel like if any of you have ever taken a licensing exam, this is what this question feels like, because it feels like so many, there's pieces of this short vignette that might fit all of these. And in looking at the voting right now, I'm seeing people going very close between B and C. So B meaning alcohol use disorder, stimulant use disorder, rule out depression, rule out PTSD. And C, some people are voting, 44% are voting PTSD, alcohol use disorder, and avoidant personality disorder. Okay, so the answer to this one would be, oh, and we're right at exactly 46% with B and C both. The better answer would be B on this. We don't know that Mike has PTSD. We know he was in the military, but based on the vignette, we don't have all the information at this time. We would like to rule out based on his military experience, but we're not sure yet. And we're not sure about the depression. It says that he's avoiding people since returning back, but that was our only key on the depression. So we're still trying to figure out the depression, the PTSD, but clearly he's been drinking and there's some meth use. So the better answer for this would be B. And it looks like, boy, this was a really tough one, and I saw that one. So thanks for voting on that one. Okay, let's go on to the next question about Mike. And again, later on, we can talk more with the questions, maybe how we came to this conclusion on the diagnosing for the co-occurring. So the next question is, based on the vignette that you had about Mike, would this be a person to consider for Healing to Wellness Court? Yes or no? So go ahead and vote on that. So your choices for no would be no, Mike's legal history is too extensive for a Healing to Wellness Court, and drugs of choice are too difficult to monitor. B, yes, Mike should be assessed as long as your program is working with high risk, high need participants. Okay, so it looks like we have an overwhelming response that yes, Mike should be considered for the program. Oh wait, yes, 97%, and that's correct. As we know, Healing to Wellness courts or drug court programs, that's the target population that we have. We work with high risk, high need. Some things that you might want to consider if you got a participant such as Mike who has different drugs of choice, we might be more mindful in working with our probation, our treatment coordinators about tailorizing maybe drug testing. So since he's using meth, we may need to test more frequent, right? We may have to administer a UA test as well as being monitored for the alcohol. We may need to, as a clinician, I may want to see Mike more frequently, right? It's not uncommon when we get someone who is a stimulant user to say, I want to see them at least 2 times a week. I might see them on Friday, right before the weekend. If the weekend is a time when relapse happened, I might want to see him on Friday. I'm making a plan, and then I might want to see him on Monday to check in with him. How did you do, Mike? How was your weekend? So more frequent in the beginning. So we might have to up our sessions with Mike to make sure that he gets the care that he needs. And that might be different for somebody who doesn't need that level of services early on in the program. So definitely Mike would be somebody who we would want to screen and assess to see if he would be a viable candidate for our program. Next slide.
Okay. So this is our final vignette. So in this vignette, we have Janet stands with a fist. She is a 49-year-old Lakota Ojibwe, recently divorced female and a Navy veteran. Lieutenant stands with a fist was a nurse and has been retired for approximately 18 months. She's had some difficulty adjusting to civilian life. She has recently begun having flashbacks to an incident that occurred early on in her career. She was sexually assaulted by one of her superior officers while at sea. She did not report this assault. Instead, she threw herself into her work and career. Lieutenant Stands with a Fist has always consumed alcohol, but recently she has begun drinking to the point that she passes out on a regular basis. While in the Navy, she was able to work with her male counterparts, but recently she has become very fearful of men. She was recently arrested for a DUI, which she entered a not guilty plea. While awaiting trial, she violated her pre-trial conditions by obtaining new charges and tested positive for alcohol. So with Lieutenant stands with a fist, and you're going to see the poll that comes up. What would be her Kurakoin disorders? Would she be, are we looking for substance use disorder mild, PTSD and depression, substance use disorder moderate, PTSD, anxiety, or depression, substance use disorder? And by the poll, by your responses, definitely. We would look for her substance use disorder moderate, in that it's having some effect on her life. She has some PTSD from the sexual assault that was once never reported, but it was also something that she just kind of just handled, or just kind of kept to herself. And then now she may be having some anxiety because her whole support system has changed, where she was once in the military and now she's a civilian. It's a culture shift for her. As we are considering Lieutenant Stands with a Fist for our Tribal Healing to Wellness Court, our Tribal Veterans Healing to Wellness Court, some of the considerations that we may want to take into account are her fear of men. We want to make sure that we don't re-traumatize her, or that we are very mindful that she has gender-specific treatment, that she has gender-only groups, that she is in groups that, you know, she feels comfortable with. Co-ed groups may not work for her because she is fearful of sharing things with a co-ed group. Also, we would want to take special considerations into maybe assigning her to a probation officer or a case manager or a compliance officer that she feels comfortable with. And it may not always be a man. We may need to make some adjustments to our Healing to Wellness Court system. Also, we may need to even take a look at her status hearing when she comes in. We may want to not have her come in as part of the whole group. We may want to adjust her sessions or her check-in session to either individually. So these are some considerations to take into when we are looking at someone who has sexual assault or some trauma issues, and, you know, making sure that we have the right groups that go along with what she needs. So next slide. Lori, can you please tell us about some screening and assessment?
Sure. I didn't know, Jill, if you were going to jump in on this one. Okay, so when we're looking at screenings and assessments, we went ahead and put together a list of some of these the screenings here are public domain. So it's important that we're screening for these co-occurring disorders. The PHQ-9 is a depression inventory, and that can be accessed online. You can, if you're not using something, this is a good place to start. I think it's a great screening, and like I said, it's not having to buy any screening tools for this. The GAD-7 it screens for anxiety, and it's just what it is. It's a 7-questionnaire form, very easy. The client can answer the questions themselves about questions pertaining to anxiety. Early on, I mentioned something about trauma-informed care. And, this is a big thing that everyone is talking about and doing right now, is that we need to be mindful of trauma. And so you know, our program probably a couple of years ago, we incorporated this, the ACE screening tool, into our intake and assessment process. And what ACE does is is it 20 questions, Jill?
I think it's only 10.
Okay, so it's 10 questions that is screening for trauma. And what this is really helpful. So when somebody gets to their first session, I can pull up the ACE screening and say, okay, you answered yes to this, that you witnessed violence in your home as a child. And so that might be something that I need to be mindful of. If my office is by a door where there's loud noises, if I'm close to the lobby and there's a lot of noise, if a client's coming in with trauma, they might respond, they might be in that hyper arousal state and be on edge the entire session, right? So I need to be mindful of that as a clinician. Is what is the trauma? Was it an absent parent? Did a parent go to prison? What did they experience? Domestic violence themselves, right? I need to be aware of that. So I really like the ACE screening, and it's a form that is being used in a majority of places now. So if you're not using it, I would recommend looking into that one. SOGS, this is a gambling screening. So any of your programs, you know, we assess for substances. Are we looking at gambling? Is this something that we need to address during our treatment? You know, so, you know, and this is something that I see often with participants, because guess what? We can screen for alcohol. We can screen for stimulants or opioids, but is there anything written that people can't go to casinos? Right? And what we know about our participants is they switch addictions. Right? So if I can't drink, guess what? I could go to the casino as long as I'm back within my curfew time, right? So our participants may start gambling. So it's important to screen for gambling as well. The other thing that, of course, the majority of people are using is when we're looking at diagnosing, we're looking at DSM-5 right now. That is kind of the Bible and the go-to for clinicians for diagnosing right now. The other two, I'm going to let Jill talk about the PLC-5 because these are more VA specific. Jill, would you mind jumping in at this?
Actually, I was hoping to jump back to the ACEs, and then actually in my mind, Lori, you had prepared the PLC-5 and the brief addition monitor, but I want to go back to the ACEs really quickly. Actually, that, just to be clear, ACEs, it does stand for adverse childhood experiences. So the inventory is really looking at experiences in someone's childhood that could have made a real impact on somebody. And I talked to our team in Pojoaque about how, you know, even doing the ACEs can be somewhat traumatic because it's really looking and taking inventory at a time that, you know, especially if it's an older veteran, it could bring up some things to really be looking back that far. So we want to be mindful, as Lori was saying, about how like the answers to that should really be informed by the treatment, and we should really be looking at how we support the client when they're exploring those things. And it was great that Lori mentioned that, you know, depending on what kind of experiences they had, you know, we need to be aware of and looking at the symptoms that they have today, you know, that hypervigilance, the hyperarousal, and even integrating that into, you know, groups and talking about trauma and bringing up, I know we've done a group in Pojoaque where, you know, we have people talk about ACEs scores, and then we talk about how to self-regulate when we're talking about and looking at the scores together. So that's important. I just wanted to touch on that. And sorry, Lori, to jump back on that.
No.
But do you feel comfortable talking about the PLC-5 and the brief addition monitor?
Sure. Well, I'm just going to touch briefly on those. Those are VA specific forms. So if one of you, it's important, if you're not working within the VA system, it's important that we just know what these forms are. So that if you're referring a veteran to VA for services, this is something that they're going to administer within their system to monitor for the PTSD or the substance use disorder. As I'm looking at the screen right now, I see that your screen says brief addiction monitor. It should be addiction. Okay, so the last one is an addiction monitor where they're going to be screening for substance use. And Jill, I really do appreciate, I know as clinicians, we talk in acronyms and we hear that, that's the feedback that we hear all the time at every session we present on is, there was a lot of acronyms and I didn't understand. Could you please explain what that means? So, we forget and we just get so comfortable saying these things. So please stop at any point and say, what is GAD, the general anxiety disorder, right? So, because I'm saying GAD-7 and ACE and SOGS and so thanks, Jill and Chris, feel free to jump in at any point. So, I don't know if you're looking for, if you want to know more about the VA specific forms, they're on the VA website. Earlier, I had said I was going to give you the site in referencing back to the prolonged exposure and the CPT. The website that you can go on to view these screening tools would be www.ptsd.va.gov. So if you go onto the VA's website, you can start navigating around and you can access these forms or you might put a keyword of addiction monitor and then it would route you to that. So you could be familiar with. I don't know that it's necessary if you're not working within the VA system to know how to use these, but just knowing that you can talk with the client saying they're going to give you some forms and they're going to be wanting to know about trauma or they're going to want to know about your substance use. I think that's important.
Yeah. And oftentimes when, we're seeing our participants that do have a lot of medical issues or are involved with other providers, it is always best practice to try and coordinate care. So the providers at the VA might send you the results to the PLC-5 or the brief addiction monitor. So it's good to just read up on those. They are brief to screen for PTSD and substance use, but ideally we are connecting and coordinating care with their VA providers so that, and we all have the tools that we use and the acronyms that we use. So these tools are important to them at the VA. And if they want to send those results, then we'll have an idea of what tool they're using to screen and assess our participants.
So I think what we
Hi,
wanted
this
to
is
do was,
Marlon Footracer from the Trebelon Policy Institute. I'm today's chat monitor, and we have a question from a participant. And that question is there access to ACEs training anywhere?
I think there's probably a training online. I think SAMHSA and has some available resources. Ladies, do you have any other resources off the top of your head that, and I mean, YouTube is such a tool. I'm sure there's a lot of, it's informal training, but I know you can watch plenty of videos online about, this simple 10-question tool. But if we'd like to, we can send some resources along with some of this information when we're done.
Right.
I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you for the question. So I think what we wanted to do was to also show you that it's a variety of instruments and tools and screenings that we utilize in order to get the information. And one of the best ones that I've ever used, and I'm old school, I still really like to do what's called a biopsychosocial assessment or a biopsychosocial interview, sometimes as you may hear it. And really what it is a really nice conversation with with the person that you're doing an assessment on, or with the person that you're doing an intake on. And it is broken down, and as on your screen you can see, it's broken down into these categories. And it's really nice and free flowing, and you can ask questions based on maybe the situation. If you are, if this is a person who is coming into your Healing to Wellness court, definitely you are going to need to know what the living and family structure of this person is, because that's one of the things we need to know in a Healing to Wellness court. Education. You would like to know what kind of education they had, where they went, you know, what grade they finished in school, you know, did they get a GED, that kind of information. Also, legal history. Now, that's something that can be corroborated with with working with your tribal court system, or, you know, your probation officers. They can have that. They can help you get that information. Also, their medical and health. By the participants' own admission, what are their health issues? What are their ailments? What is their pain? As we looked in some of the vignettes that we gave you, we had one individual who had some chronic pain issues. That was by his own. And so that was him telling the clinician or the intake person, you know, I have this pain that I'm always dealing with. Okay. Now, can that be corroborated by getting a release of information from their medical provider? So that's another thing. Also, their cultural and spiritual orientation or identification. Do they identify with their own tribal culture? Or do they identify as a faith-based culture? Those are important things that we would need to also find out. Prior treatment history. Have they gone to either some kind of inpatient or residential treatment facility? Have they attempted or tried outpatient before? So those are kind of things we want to know. Substance use. We know that they are coming in either as a court-ordered client or court or a Healing to Wellness court person, but we want to know what they say about their substance use disorder. It goes back to the question that Lori was posed earlier, is do they want to quit? And that's a very valid question to ask of someone. Do they want to quit? They may not want to quit using alcohol at that time. And I know from my fellow substance abuse counselors that I might get some emails or comments. But these are questions that we need to ask of our participants. Definitely their military history. From the vignettes, we noted that we had a couple of them who had less than honorable discharges, and they may feel that they may not be able to access services to the VA. We also had a situation where Lieutenant Stans with a Fist was a retired person, but she had this incident that happened in her career. And I was looking at the chat box or the question box, and someone gave a really nice a referral that we could refer, because it's one of those military type kind of things that we could do. Also, employment. Are they employed? Are they self-employed? Do they have any kind of past physical, sexual, emotional abuse, domestic violence? Do they feel safe in their home right now? Any hospitalizations for anything? Any socio-cultural type kind of questions? You know, what kind of things do they like to do for fun? This is a really good time for us to start looking at those things that we can start engaging them in pro-social activities, because that is one of the things that we want to do in a Healing to Wellness court. So these are all just kind of categories that we would ask during a really good biopsych social interview. It's one of my favorite. I don't mind the amount of time that one would take to sit and just have a nice conversation with an individual, with a participant. Next slide. So as we noted in the biopsychosocial interview section, we are also looking at an individual's cultural identity. So it's important for us as providers to assess that person's cultural identity in order to best serve them. They may self-identify as whatever tribe of origin or whatever tribe they are at, or whatever tribal land they're living on, but they also may identify in some other culture. For example, the LGBT culture, the military culture, they may have a different cultural identity. So that's something we definitely need to know. And in regards to cultural identity, that some of the presenting problems may stem from that client's cultural beliefs. And this is also something that we should pay attention to. There, in the variety of tribes that we have in the United States, we all have these ailments, these things that can be tied back to our traditional beliefs. And also that some of these problems may be rooted in the military, the culture of the military. In the vignette that Lori presented, Mike, he was 18 when he went into the military, fresh off the reservation, probably got sent to a boot camp hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles away from his cultural home. And then probably his first stop was maybe somewhere outside of the country. So he has this exposure to all of these things so quickly. And then not just that, but the culture of the military is very, very different. My father is a Navy veteran. And when he gets around with other Navy veterans, there's this kind of camaraderie, there's this talk that they have. I also have very dear friends who are Marines. They are always Marines and always will be Marines. So there's a very different culture with that. So there is this, when we are working with our Native veterans in Healing to Wellness course, these are things to pay attention to. Also knowing our tribal resources. For example, tribal healers or ceremonies that could benefit the clients as they are reintegrating back into our communities, our tribal communities, or may help benefit them in the treatment process. They may want to find out what their cultural identity is. They may want a healing ceremony. So having access to someone either on our staff or within our community, knowing who that person is so we can help access or help direct or help guide that person. And then that person can also help guide us in treatment. So these are really important things for us to pay attention to. So next slide.
And we've talked about this some, but I can't emphasize enough how important it is to take into consideration the medical needs for our veterans who are coming into wellness court. So, you know, many veterans that are experiencing co-occurring disorders, they do face the barriers for proper medical care. The engagement with the medical system can be intimidating, and you know that it can be really difficult for them to feel comfortable going in and asking for help for their medical issues if, you know, we've said it, if they're not ready to stop, if they're not ready to change. So they may find themselves really reluctant to engage in services. And if you know anyone or yourself or clients who are experiencing chronic pain, it's pretty hard to pay attention. It's pretty hard to sit in your own skin and be comfortable. It's important that, you know, they have the opportunity when they're participants to be guided towards the proper medical care in order to feel comfortable, to figure out medical avenues that will support them in their well-being and in their recovery, and that recovery includes their medical needs as well. And for a lot of folks, and for our veterans in particular, if they're still active in their addiction, they're going to be struggling. They're oftentimes struggling with mental health concerns. So much like general participants in all of our wellness courts, this is a consideration to think about for our veterans as well. And of course, right now, something to think about, medical concerns can put our veterans at higher risk right now because of COVID-19. So, in the first slide, thinking about how we take into consideration people who might be more medically fragile and adapting to the safety that our courts need to start thinking about and moving towards to keep everybody safe and ensure that we're not putting anybody at risk. So it's important to be looking at all these medical considerations in addition to the mental health and the substance use. Next slide.
So I'm just going to say a couple of things here because, excuse me, tomorrow you are going to get two very well-versed and well-experienced presenters in Ray Daw and Sean Bear, and they are going to go through this topic and many other topics so well. So I don't want to, I want to give them a little shout out before tomorrow. But part of the historical trauma is also not only just what our own tribal historical trauma is, and it varies from tribe to tribe to tribe, from region to region, and even from person to person. We may have, for example, we may have tribes who have removal histories, who were removed from their own tribal lands and then brought back and to settle in much smaller places. We may have tribes who have had tribal battles with a neighboring tribe, and sometimes that still goes on. So paying attention to those tribal historical trauma issues is also very important. Also, the historical trauma of Native Americans serving in the military. I don't know what this specific statistic is, but I know that it's been quoted several times. Native Americans have a large percentage of our people represented in the military, and we have even before we were given citizenship as American citizens. And when you see a Native veteran, there's some of them who are very, very proud. I mentioned my father. He has tons of Navy caps. He has a Navy T-shirt. When Navy and Army play, we always root for Navy. So there's that pride among them. But then there's also some of the things that they endured while in the military. And if you tune in tomorrow to Sean and Ray, they will definitely tell you. Being called chief as a reference to them being Native American in their service, being put in special positions or special jobs just because they were Native Americans. So there's a lot of that as well. Like I said, I'm just barely scratching the surface. You will get so much more information tomorrow from Ray and Sean. Next slide.
So some of the common modalities of treatment for co-occurring disorders, cognitive behavioral therapy. This one, it really helps people understand what the thoughts are and the feelings behind their behavior. So it's going to challenge people on these, cognitive distortions or these thoughts, and hopefully the idea is that when we start challenging these beliefs and these thoughts, we start understanding that our behaviors are a response or reaction to these thoughts. It also is trying to help increase our ability for, emotional regulation, teaching coping skills, and things like that. But one of the more common forms in wellness court is called MRT. So you may be familiar with that, and that's a common CBT approach or cognitive behavioral therapy approach that's used with wellness courts. And in that sense, with MRT, it's really challenging, you know, the process and the thought process about criminal decisions and you know, thoughts and feelings about addiction. And some of you might already be familiar with or using MRT. So DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, is a form of CBT, so a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's also challenging those beliefs and also teaching skills around mindfulness. So people being really mindful of those thoughts that come up. It's like trying to find what beliefs that you keep thinking that are making your life really hard, right? So some of our veterans might be thinking, you know, I always have to be ready for war. And how is that impacting their life? So teaching them the mindfulness that, you know, I may be ready for that, but I need to start changing so that my body, changing that thought so that my body and my behaviors can be more at ease. You know, we're not always in war. So challenging those thoughts that our veterans might have pretty commonly. And therapeutic communities, it's an environment where people can live together in co-housing that incorporates the resources such as 12-step meetings, access to therapy, and really the peer-to-peer support that's important for people in recovery, especially veterans. The types of therapeutic communities that are available for veterans, and we've talked about this and Chris mentioned it, there is a culture to that can be just as healing when people are in recovery as well. So, and Lori and I were talking earlier, one of the more common therapeutic communities that you may have heard of is something called like an Oxford house. So housing that people, you know, share together, they're all in recovery and they may attend meetings together or they might hold meetings at their home together. And COPE and the prolonged exposure therapy and the cognitive processing therapy, I won't go too far into that because Lori did an excellent job explaining those earlier. But they're, again, excellent for the PTSD that a lot of our veterans might be coming home with. Next slide.
So at this time, if you have any questions, if we need to pay attention more to the chat box, or if Marlon has kind of brought any question to our attention, great, that would be great.
Hi everyone, this is Marlon again from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. All the questions that were submitted have been addressed. Just as a housekeeping note, when folks are submitting their last questions before the conclusion of today's session, to register for tomorrow's and the rest of the week's webinars, you can visit our website, which is wellnesscourts.org. That is WELLNESSCOURTS.org.
And also, Marlon, just to add, that website also has several of our Tribal Healing to Wellness Court resources. We have a resource book that specifically talks about case management in Healing to Wellness Courts, and then also treatment in Healing to Wellness Courts. So they definitely tie in to this topic today. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and hope that you continue with us throughout the week. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.